This is what we're looking at. The federal government says we have 40 years, approximately, of fossil fuels. Now let's say that their figure is accurate, give or take 10 years. That is not a significant figure until you start looking at the depletion, until you start looking at what happens when you're halfway there, what happens to the price of the remaining fossil fuel. We have the latitude to do enormous changes in this society. We have the energy resources to make these changes. However, these are not simple changes I'm talking about.
No, they're not.
No, they're not really simple changes. We're just going to have to bite the bullet on some things and say this is going to cost us. I say frequently that I do not want to be put in the position, I refuse to be put in the position of having to tell my grandchildren, and I have grandchildren, I'm sorry, there's no more world for you. We used it all up.
Like you kind of have to go into it with the spoilers on and to realize that that's not really what's happening. That's the story that's being told in Dune, like the book that sort of stands alone, but like narratively and storytelling wise, that's not why Frank Herbert has singled out the Paul Atreides story, right? Is to say, oh, look at the like it in fact it when you take that longer view of it, it's very critical of it. And I think like Timothée Chalamet gave a really interesting quote. He called it an anti-hero's journey.
How do we define like an anti-hero though? In like when I think of like anti-heroes in modern film and television, the one that comes to my head always when I think of an anti-hero is Walter White.
As kind of a culmination of the, like, I feel like Walter White is like kind of a refinement and like a finished product of the anti-hero as it's been built over the decades, you know?
No, but here's the thing though, is that like Walt, like in the end of Breaking Bad is the villain, 100% the villain, is the antagonist to everyone else basically going, you know, in the story.
Within Dune Part 1 and Part 2, as they're going to be presented in these movies, you're not going to sort of get that arc, right?
Right.
Honestly, like Paul Atreides is the anti-hero to such an extent that character's challenge in the later books is like trying to get the universe off the path that he set it on, right? There's a whole lot of the second book that is very concerned and filled with all this apprehension for this path, right? That Paul Atreides is setting the universe on.
Mm-hmm.
And that by the time that he is the 4,000-year-old, you know, sandworm, who's also the emperor of the galaxy, right? That it's like he almost doesn't have a choice anymore. Like he's completely trapped by this notion of the future, which Frank Herbert brought up in 1985 and throughout his writing, and that notion of if we truly know the future, if we truly reach prescience, right, that we're prisoners then. And that is Paul Atreides. Paul Atreides is the prisoner of prescience, right? And that ends up being, you know, that the destination for that character. And so he's the anti-hero, he's the antagonist of everything to such an extent that and I think this is the critical thing with the anti-hero, he is his own antagonist, right? That the biggest enemy of Paul Atreides, the God Emperor, is Paul Atreides, right? And that's where this story ends up. I think that the first book, it's hard to resist this sort of like zeitgeist, great man of history, white saviorism that reads very simply, I think, off of the screen if you were just coming in completely cold and consuming Dune as a piece of media. You know, so we've kind of outlined the show. We're going to focus our conversation on you know, sort of UAP tech in the world of Frank Herbert. We're going to touch on neo-feudalism in the world of Frank Herbert, the thing that's brought Dune up on the show already. We're going to shift to cover materialism and the environment, and then we're going to finish with this conversation about white saviors that I've sort of hinted at here.
I mean, so when I first read the book many years ago, when I was in high school, it wasn't long before we were in college, but it struck a chord with me, you know, as like young dude, like coming of age story a little bit, kind of on the surface. And, it's got cool sci-fi stuff going on, and there's interesting comments on ecology and stuff like that. And so it like that struck a chord with me. It's interesting looking at this, several years later, and now I'm talking about like topics like neo-feudalism, and we're looking at it through that kind of lens. And we're also now looking at it through the lens of like, what kind of comparisons can we make with Dune and our own future if we're going to continue to talk about like the technology behind, what's being displayed as unexplained aerial phenomena and whatnot. So there's a lot to be said about the universe that Frank Herbert has made in terms of like where our own pathway is sort of going via capitalism. Because at some point, the concept of the modern state that we have now gets transcended by the complete and utter concentration of private power. I don't know. When we talk to Nick Rogers, I know he kind of disputes a little bit like the idea that we kind of like circle back to neo-feudalism. Is that, if I remember correctly, that's kind of how he was sort of portraying that. He's right to an extent. But I think that capitalism eventually, sort of in my view, does kind of destroy itself a little bit, but that opens, the doorway for a situation maybe potentially similar to this, for that to happen. These are very kind of like human-centric ideas of science fiction, how we think it's going to be. Right. And as I've always said, like, I don't know if that's going to at all be like that, because again, we have to consider that there's this whole other variable going on that like is addressing topics like consciousness and operating outside of materialism. And like Dune kind of gets to that.
It does this really nice job of showing both.
Yeah, I don't think it comes close though to what is actually going on though with UFOs and other associated paranormal phenomena and stuff like that. Because that is so far out of the realm of materialism.
Yeah, and I think that with Herbert, he leaves a lot of the tech undescribed, right? Yeah. I think that and I've heard him in 1985. He gave this speech at UCLA, and I was listening to him sort of talk about,
which is a really interesting way of doing it. Him not really kind of addressing it in that way, yeah.
Especially in this genre, right? And what he's pointed out is that what the science fiction that he's doing is like a political science fiction, right? Where it's not about what we can do with the tech. It's almost more like, what if somebody had written sci-fi for political science instead of for like computing, right? And that's sort of what Herbert is in the sort of the interpretive act of doing with Dune. And so just to sort of bore in a little bit on like the story and try to like give somebody like a portable version of Dune that they might be able to deploy here in this episode. And we'd super recommend, reading it, seeing the movie, right? Getting this whole sense of it. But if I was going to try to, explain in an elevator ride what Dune is, I would say that, yes, that Dune describes a post-computational intergalactic future for humanity in which a group in charge of the metaphysical and genetic development of humanity realizes the heir to that project and loses control of it. Paul Atreides being the heir to that project, right? The Bene Gesserit being the group I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that moves at the center of this story, is that there's a sort of entirely female, like metaphysical sect that occupies a position of power in this post-computational feudal order and has been directing the religious and genetic development of people.
Yeah.
Right. And that the end goal of that project was an individual that would be prescient, right? An individual that would rule the universe as the sort of final divine arbiter of the way things are. And so this story gets unfolded, right, on a planet that is the material base for this society. The methods, the material, the technology that spread humanity across, this universe has been purged, right, through a process called the Butlerian Jihad. And the result is a society where interstellar navigation is only possible through the psychedelic effects of this material that's available only on this planet that Paul Atreides and his family have been sent to rule at the start of this movie, right? And the story is about how Paul helps the indigenous people of this planet seize control of the Imperium, right, as a product of their centrality to the material workings of this universe, right? And so that's like, I don't know, like it's a very difficult thing to give like a concise 2 minutes on.
Yeah, right.
but the result here is that you have a story that is very ripe for like political and social commentary, right? And so that's what we're hoping to just sort of lay out here in this segment.
Right.
I also wanted to talk about Frank Herbert a little bit, who I think is actually like just a pretty normal dude. Like listening to him talk, right? Like for like a mid-century guy, like, like he's like,
besides the fact that he wrote the masterpiece of science fiction,
right?
Like,
that he is, I don't know, he's like kind of sexist and homophobic and a little full of himself, and like all of these things that aren't like really that surprising when you see them on the ground. And I think that you can observe them.
See, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, so there's the sort of aberrant gay that he holds up as the main antagonist in this first story, right?
Yeah.
So we're thinking of the Baron Harkonnen, who is presented as the only homosexual character really in this universe, as a pedophile, right? As somebody who is, sadomasochistic and violent, right? In their sexual tendencies, right? All this stuff, and it's like a shorthand, right? I mean, in addition to it using other tropes other than that, like just making Harkonnen absurdly fat or what have you, right? So there's a lot of ways to like critique Frank Herbert, and I think that the thing that makes Dune worthwhile is that Frank Herbert is as unremarkable as he is, right? That I think that what we mean to do here is to not say, here's an uncritical, hagiography of Frank Herbert, but to say that what we have here is a journalist and a writer who is committed to the craft, right? And adept at world building. I'm not so sure that Frank Herbert is a great writer in terms of like prose and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But he, like so many other people in this medium, is a world builder, right? In much the way that like, George Lucas shouldn't direct and produce, right? Like,
right.
And these types of things, right?
What does that say about like Tolkien though, for example? Because the world building, like obviously Tolkien had down, but I thought that he was.
But he's a poet too. Yeah, he's effectively a poet as well. And I think if you were going to draw a real distinction between what is the difference between this world that Herbert makes and these other super imaginative, even fantasy like landscapes, it's that, right? It's that Frank Herbert like isn't a poet.
Right.
And I think if he were, he wouldn't have, as he so eloquently put it in an interview one time, he wouldn't have been supporting his writing problem with a journalism job.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that like we should acknowledge here at the front that like, as much as we sort of appreciate this universe, it's, it is the flawed product of a flawed mind. Right.
Sure.
And that we also on this show acknowledge the difference between the art and the artist, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to. So what did you notice on screen about the ships, about the technology as it was shown in Dune? Can I say I watched this movie? We got there a little late, and I
Mm.
saw this movie from like the second row, and it was very
Oh wow! So
imposing.
we
It was
sat we sat in the back row.
right.
So I mean, okay, the ships, like, we just sort of see them and they're just kind of doing their thing, and there's not really much else. And I think that's kind of the point. It's interesting, yeah. Like, when I think of like giant ships in like Star Wars, for example,
Right.
there's obviously moments where like, wow, that's imposing. Okay, the scene when the Harkonnen troops, at the order of the Emperor, are attacking Dune, Arrakis, and we see one of these ships, like, kind of, it's like peeking through the cloud cover, or the dust, smoke, just, that sort of cover there right over Arakeen.
Some of what I noticed about the ships was their silence,
Yeah,
and their lack of an evident like propulsion source.
we never see them do anything, and so it's interesting. This was the other thing that I totally missed this, but either the Spacing Guild, which is talked about so much in the first book, was barely mentioned in the movie. And they're the whole, like,
Right.
they're the whole mechanism for which people can do faster than light travel in the Dune universe. And
Right.
I mean, like, for anyone listening, or if you know, Michael, like, when did they talk about the Spacing Guild? I don't remember them ever really mentioning it.
So it's mostly delivered narratively, right? Like, or not even narratively. It's delivered through narration.
Yeah,
right?
like, the attack was obviously facilitated by the Spacing Guild.
Right. Yeah.
They're the ones who control that, and so it's,
or that Harkonnen, yes, and that all of these great houses and everything, and we ought to point this out here, that sort of the way that this world maintains itself is through the Spacing Guild, which, as we had sort of pointed out in our portable description, that they use the psychedelic products of the spice melange, right, to guide interstellar travel mentally, using the effects of this drug, basically. And I think that it's that, like, psychotronic but also like intensely material aspect of it that I think has a really interesting place. That it's like almost the conceptual act of portraying what Frank Herbert was describing on screen. I think it's not just that CGI has gotten better. I think it's that we, like, and particularly, like, Hollywood elites and the people who construct these culture defining visuals have only recently begun to be able to conceptualize themselves. Right. And that it's that George Lucas, it's got to be like the biggest combustion engine you ever saw on the biggest triangle you ever saw, like, because that's where the mind goes. But I think that there's this really fascinating balance in Frank Herbert's world, and this is sort of what I want to close our conversation on UAP Tech with, is that he has this very fascinating balance between, like, the psychic and the material, right? That in fact that's the entire, that it's the capacity of Paul Atreides to monopolize both the psychic and the material, through his not just his status as the Kwisatz Haderach, foretold by the Bene Gesserit, but also through his position as the rightful ruler of Arrakis, right? That this sort of physical and material and metaphysical and divine are reconciled through Paul Atreides, right? And that he is the only zeitgeist that could bring stability and order to this universe, right? And I think that along this line, Frank Herbert has said something interesting in 1985 to the effect of, quote, "As we increase what we know, we increase our exposure to what we do not know." I think that this is a universe that's very, very aware of that physic, right? And I think that our the world we're living in right now is increasingly
more strange and weird and
exposed to things we haven't been exposed to before because we've been increasing what we know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's I think if you were looking for like the je ne sais quoi of Dune and the reason that it manages to persist, it's that, right? It's this sort of basic physic of that universe where, the more control over a situation that you get, the more out of control you really become.
Yeah. I think it's interesting you bring up that we never really hear the ships. So that sort of, and I can't really remember how much that particular kind of small detail is at all discussed in the books, but
right. That's the thing. It's completely it's left up to the reader and therefore left up to the director to say, okay, well, how does this stuff work? How does this stuff look? How does this?
It's an interesting decision by the people who made this film and Mr. Villeneuve to not have any sound
or evident combustion.
Evident combustion, which is very, very interesting. Obviously, when we think about what was toying with naval pilots off the coast of San Diego in 2004. So,
and I don't think it's an accident that this sort of looks that way. Yeah. I think that somebody like Denis Villeneuve, who is all about the sort of metaphysical of film, right, and is to sort of appreciate that's not an accident. That when Denis Villeneuve sat down to say, what do the spaceships look like in Frank Herbert's universe? He said, what are the spaceships going to look like in our universe?
We're talking about a guy who made this film and also made the film Arrival, which is literally about interdimensional entities, aliens, coming to visit us in these bizarre ships that don't make any sense and stuff like that. So
and so I just like that I was very struck by it. I mean, part of it was because coming off the back of the episode we did last week and all this sort of stuff that I I was primed.
We should consider reviewing at some point is Arrival.
Mm-hmm.
That's easily like one of my favorite films ever created by far. I think it's a very sort of optimistic view of what it would look like if we encountered non-human intelligence. But I don't think obviously that's going to be at all the situation when the time comes.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Sure. So, and we had sort of talked about it in the intro, and I wanted to make sure to gesture back myself to episode 4, The Billionaires Won COVID, featuring Nick Rogers. That episode, we talked a little bit about neo-feudalism. In fact, it's largely the focus of where we end up in that interview. And part of what drove me to think about the term and this whole notion and the multi-directional travel of human development is because of Dune, right? It's because I think that the universe that Frank Herbert depicts and its feudal qualities are eminently imaginable in a world where state and public power is being subordinated by private interests and capital. And that the world being made right now by, whether it's, the cryptocurrency bros or Jeff Bezos, is a world where that is what the most meaningful, pull of power will be.
He who controls the Bitcoin controls the world.
Right. What Nick Rogers, a PhD student at Yale, told us in that episode, was, that he wasn't so sure that we need a term like neo-feudalism to describe the way that capital can deindustrialize itself and even decommercialize itself, right? That when we think about, because the example that I like to trot out as sort of imminently imaginable is is Elon Musk's mining freighter, right? And
speaking of, I love that I saw like an article, like I didn't read it, but the headline, it was like CNBC was like, Elon Musk has the potential to be the world's first trillionaire, which is just wonderful.
Sure.
Wonderful.
Well, and that what becomes of our debt if we don't have a political solution to it? What becomes of the debt that we owe our creditors when Elon Musk has a mining freighter and an asteroid made of platinum somewhere out beyond the orbit of Mars or something, right? Like, and what Nick Rogers came on the show and told us quite, astutely, is that I'm not sure that looks all that different from mining towns in coal patch America in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? That I don't know that we need to invent a new term for that, right? I think that's existed, and it's existed under capitalism. But I think you're fooling yourself if you think that the only vector of control in sort of a post-state neo-feudal context would be the vector of control operated by Gilded Age mining companies, right? Like that I think that the problem with a post-state order like this is it does eventually need like a spiritual and an ideological and metaphysical justification, right? That the mechanisms of power and control are actually pretty tenuous in terms of how they affect people's everyday lives, and that the divine right of nobles and of divinely ordained families easily fills that. And we basically, and the thing is I think we think we're a lot farther away from that than we actually are. That the assumption of property inheritance is the same as the assumption of the inheritance of the divine right. That there was something in your bloodline that means that you shouldn't have to suffer or struggle, that you should have a social position because of something that happened before you were even on Earth, et cetera, that this is the version of it that elites have to operate now, and that put under a different kind of pressure, right? The pressure of neo-feudalism, that elites would come up with a similar sort of divine justification for the power that they're wielding. That Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos will have to come up with a metaphysical justification for what they're doing, because it's not going to come from the consent of the governed and these things that have held up, public authority over the last 200 to 300 years. So in 1985, Herbert told a crowd at UCLA that he wrote Dune to show and critique what we give up to elites, right? And that, in effect, with Paul Atreides, the assertion is that that in that negotiation we actually give up basically everything. That is what we're shown with Paul Atreides, is that Paul Atreides gets to that point where he knows the future, right? Whereas this notion of a future, that's something that we can decide between like people and their decisions and everything. But when we talk about the future, right, we're talking about something that is like that we're passive participants in, that's inevitable, right? And that when you have this perception of authority, right, this divine neo-feudal perception of authority, that really that's what you're talking about, right? You're talking about the inevitability of the maintenance of this system of power. That's how we.
Is that thunder?
Yeah, there's a big clap. We're getting a storm.
Oh,
but yeah, that's ultimately, that is the antagonist of Frank Herbert's universe. The antagonist of Frank Herbert's universe is the future predetermined by omnipotent elites, basically. And I think that's easily missed, but that's the critique of neo-feudalism that Frank Herbert has here, is that when we have this sort of Hegelian zeitgeist in charge of everything, that all we're locked into their future, the path as they see it. And that's what ends up happening, in Dune with Paul Atreides. I mean, it seemed like a cheap editing trick at a certain point where it's like, anyway, so here's 16 seconds of Zendaya at the golden hour.
Right.
Next plot point.
Yeah. Yeah.
I read a critique of this movie that accused it of being relatively soulless, right?
Mm-hmm. See, that's the thing. So, okay, we can talk a little bit real quick about that, because I think as a film, in what was done in terms of cinematography and stuff like that, I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was cast very well, and yeah, and it was well acted. But there was an element of this film that I think kind of matches that description a little bit. Not to completely knock against it, because I still really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great film. But in terms of this director's films that he's made, like, my favorite of his is Arrival. I think it's better. I think Arrival is better than this film. And I think Blade Runner 2049 or 2048, whichever one it is, the year, is the Blade Runner sequel that he made is utterly fantastic and is better than the first one.
So here's because they had something very funny. Okay, here you go.
Is it NPR?
Because you brought up Arrival. Yeah, you brought up Arrival and Blade Runner 2049. Here's the sentence. This was on Fresh Air. Justin Chang. This is Justin Chang's review on Fresh Air. Sci-fi epic Dune is an immersive but incomplete experience. Here's the graph and I think this is as savage as it gets when you write for NPR.
Yeah.
Quote, I've never been a huge fan of Denis Villeneuve's technically stupendous but oddly soulless movies like Prisoners and Incendies, or brought into the notion that he's some kind of second coming of Stanley Kubrick. Still, there's no question that he's well prepared for this assignment as the director of moodily ambitious science fiction like Arrival, probably his best film, and Blade Runner 2049.
Yeah, literally what I just said.
I love the shade of that, of the syntax there, where they're like, which is kind of what you've hinted at here, where it's like, yeah, Arrival's really good. Also, he did Blade Runner.
I mean, I think for Arrival is my personal favorite film of his, and I disagree with the soullessness of his previous films. I think that was more present in this film a little bit than previous ones, and I think that's just the nature of trying to make a film for Dune. It's just this is an incredibly difficult undertaking as a director and a cinematographer and a writer to do, and I think
it's about, and that's because this is a story about materialism and the environment, right? And I think that's why I put this under this topic in our discussion, is because I think that the thing with Dune, right? And it may be that this is part of how Villeneuve always works, and that's the reason that he was chosen to do this. But I think that with Dune, it's particularly, it's particularly the case that this is like the obvious protagonist is not the actual protagonist of the story that's being unfolded. Most of what we're trying to communicate here is how awful this place is that they've been sent to live, right? And the horrible conditions that the average person is living in on the surface of this planet, right? And meanwhile, it's like in the context of just like miserable brutalist architecture, right? And so it's like it's supposed like that, and I think that's kind of what you're saying. Like it's supposed to be soulless, and it's mostly be like a product of the narrative.
So I guess what I'm saying is that I think that people, well, maybe the better way to put this is that there's a misinterpretation of the soullessness going on in the film.
Well, and it may be a problem that Villeneuve has as a director. Like, I'm not necessarily like rejecting that analysis, but I'm saying that it's been well deployed in this story, right?
Yeah. Yes. I maybe could see it a little bit for a film like Prisoners, which is still a very good film that I enjoy. But like soullessness in Arrival and Blade Runner, I disagree with. Arrival has that it factor for me personally that I really, really thoroughly enjoyed the first time I watched it in 2016. So
I was listening to somebody talk about Frank Herbert and he was talking about Dune as a campus book, which is a term I hadn't heard before.
Very interesting term. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's like you have to imagine that, like in the 60s, college students didn't have like TVs in their dorm rooms.
Yeah, they didn't have Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu.
I mean, it's that for sure, but not even, you have to imagine, like, it would have been a hell of a thing to have had a TV in a dorm room in the 60s, right? And so like the entertainment is like fiction books, right? In a way that I think is kind of easy to miss, in a way that wasn't even true in homes in the United States at the time. Like I think in people's homes, it was less true, but in the 60s on college campuses, people were still reading fiction. And Dune was one of these books, right? It was one of these books of the 60s counterculture. And for as much complexity as Frank Herbert has in this world, at the end of the day, I think it's very easy for me to imagine a member of the 60s counterculture reading this book and making relatively easy conclusions about it, right?
Yeah.
Like that they were, the Kwisatz Haderach. They were, Muad'Dib. And that spoke to the sort of individuality of 60s counterculture, right? And that these very simple conclusions that you can dash through Dune and get to and say, okay, there we go. I've read it, on to, whatever's next in that Wikipedia
whatever the
page
next
I was looking at
was, right?
Yeah. And I think that, like, when I saw it from that perspective, and I realized sort of the context that it was being, consumed as like popular media before it had been given the prestige, it's apparent to me what folks probably took away from it in their average reading through. I mean, because you have to imagine, like, people reading this book the same way people might watch a Netflix series or something, right? And that you could watch it on one level and take it in this way, and watch it on another level, and it means something completely different. But what it would have spoken to within the members of the 60s counterculture is this white savior complex, right? That ultimately Paul Atreides and his family are the chosen people to come to Dune and
save the indigenous people,
right? Yeah. Right, from themselves.
Right.
Quoted from Herbert here. Herbert has this, the same address in 85, where he's talking about how even primitive societies do not make the best choices. Right. He's thinking of ancient man running mammoths and buffalo off of cliffs, and the types of extinction events that existed even before industrialism, even before settled human society, right? That we were using material this way, right? That's acceptable, but it does sort of nod towards what I think within Herbert is sort of this Rudyard Kipling instinct towards the white savior. I think women are. So the portrayal of the women in this story is interesting. Herbert is likely with the Lady Jessica, who's the main like female person in the story. It's Paul Atreides' mother, right? That character is based off Herbert's second wife, right? And as well, you have the Zendaya's character, Chani, both of whom are concubines of Duke Leto Atreides and Paul Atreides. And in fact, Paul is who Paul is because of his Bene Gesserit genetic line, right? And through this training he's gotten from his mother, et cetera, right? And not because of Duke Leto or anything that he's really getting through this patrilineal line. The last sentence or whatever of Dune, of the first book, is something to this effect, right? Where Jessica is acknowledging to Chani that this is their status, right? That they are the concubines of these great men, and that's how like the novel ends, and I think, and from that perspective, Paul is a bastard, right? Of Duke Leto, and that I think it's really, the gender and sexual politics of Dune resist easy analysis, I think, and I wanted to sort of make sure that we had kind of acknowledged that whatever Paul is as a white savior, he is because of his mother, right? And that's just a weird. It would be, you would reach easier conclusions about Dune if that weren't that way.
And I mean, I don't know how much of that is intentional on Herbert's part, but regardless, it does sort of complicate the way that we analyze it.
Well, and he has Leto and Paul. The reason that they have these relationships with these other women is because of the political value of them remaining like unattached. I mean, the reason that Paul ends up like able to consolidate his position at the head of the Imperium at the end of this book, is because he marries the Emperor's daughter, right? And that's the thing that keeps Chani in this position that Lady Jessica had always been in, because Leto had been maintaining his bachelor status because it was politically useful to him, right?
Yeah.
And this is how that's all justified by Frank Herbert. And I don't know what to make of that. Like it doesn't have to be like some sort of noble quality of these stories, but it is there. And I think what we're getting at here, and this is sort of where I wanted to close on Dune, was to say that I think there's a spoilers necessary version or way to watch this movie.
Oh yeah. The casual viewer who has no concept of what's going on in this universe needs to have read the book or needs to know the plot beforehand.
Because otherwise it's just white saviors.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think you need to, for people who have not really been introduced to this universe within the genre of science fiction, you should 100% read a summary before you go in and watch it. Even if you know who's going to die, and what happens, you should still do it just to get a grasp of what you're going to encounter, because it will help.
And the story's like, 65 years old or something. So I mean, there aren't even really real spoilers anymore. But Paul Atreides is not the protagonist of Dune. And I think that if I could tell one person, if I could tell everyone who goes to see that movie cold anything, it's that. And I don't know. Maybe Frank Herbert could have done more to give us that in the first book. But it's so inescapably his design once you've read anything that goes on after that.
Officially, the Federal Reserve is set to ban policymakers from owning individual stocks and restrict trading following recent controversy. So, kind of a misleading headline, because you hear policymakers and it sounds like they're banning all of Congress, basically, which is not the case. They're quite literally just banning those who are sitting on the Federal Open Market Committee and their associated senior staff. That's what I got from the CNBC article. And any publicly elected official who is having any sort of direct sort of interaction with the Fed, basically, it can no longer do that. So, like, is it a step in the right direction? Yes. Is it a big enough step? Fuck no.
There's a certain chunk of progressives in the United States that think that we can like campaign finance law our way out of the problems that we have as like a society right now. and I think that like this is an example of the type of reform. We just need to get rid
of Citizens United and we'll save the world. Right.
Exactly. That sort of segment who like there was nothing wrong in American politics.
I disagree with that. Not that I disagree with that.
But these are also people who like if you ask them, it's like, okay, well, do you understand that these were problems present in American politics before Citizens United, right? Like that we were on this road already. But I think that this idea that, we have just this revolving door of policymakers into the private sector, lobbying firms, et cetera, and the doable reform is the Federal Open Market Committee, which is 12 guys in the Federal Reserve who, admittedly, probably shouldn't have vested market interests, but this is like what is doable. right?
Yeah.
This is the type of reform that we can actually accomplish. And I want to, who is the organ? Yeah. This is just internally done by the Federal Reserve, right? Like this isn't like the legislature did something. This is like the Federal Reserve said, hey, the people who serve on our internal committee can't have stocks of a certain quotient or whatever.
Right. The other reason why I selected this article was because it was, and I think it still is, it's the most upvoted article on either the politics subreddit or the news subreddit on Reddit, which I was like, okay, sounds interesting because the headline is pretty flashy.
So here's my theory of like news consumption in the United States is that we're at a point where like even if you consider yourself to be someone who like reads the articles or whatever, that you are really mostly taking in the finer points of your news through push notifications, right? This is my push notification theory of the American electorate, right? That's all anybody gets. And actually that I think that like we should start to do politics around it. Like that that at the national level, like a political party has to start planning for the fact that nobody's taking in any of this information except for in like 150 characters in a notification, right? And that's how we should start to operate as political creatures.
Oh yeah. So in sort of kind of mild relation to that news story, the wealthiest 10% of Americans now own a record 89% of all U.S. stocks.
Well, they're not on the Federal Reserve Market Committee, so problem solved.
The top 1% gained over 6.5 trillion in corporate equities and mutual fund wealth during the pandemic, according to the latest data from none other than the Federal Reserve. And the bottom 90% of Americans held about 11% of stocks and added 1.2 trillion in wealth during the pandemic.
I had read an article this last week that was talking about the role of this wealthiest 10%. And I increasingly do identify them as perpetrators. I think there's a lot of people even on the left, oftentimes because they're from this 10%, a lot of people on the left who really the only culpable people are like literally like Jeff Bezos and like people who own petroleum companies, right? And everybody else is just like just a worker.
Dude.
Right. Just a worker.
Dude just trying to make it, man.
Right.
Like
right. And that's my thing is that it's and I'm less thinking in these cases, I'm thinking about like the wealthiest 10% of Americans, right? I think globally, the top 10%, I think may be less culpable, but in the United States, the top 10% of Americans, right, are the like suburban petite bourgeois element around which both Democratic and Republican politics, revolve. And I think that, I think that they are that it's that chunk, right, of Americans that really have benefited and profited from the deterioration of our ecology and labor and everything else. And I think that there's been a reluctance, and there still is a reluctance among progressives to name them, right? To name the top 10% of Americans as the chief perpetrators of climate catastrophe, climate denial, the deterioration and immiseration of the condition of the average worker, right? And there's this deep reluctance because that 10% that they're big media consumers. They watch all the news. And so you can't just say that, right? You can't just identify them as perpetrators if you're like, Rachel Maddow or something. But I think it is inescapably true at this point. And so it should come as no surprise that they're also the ones that own all the stakes and all of the companies and all the wealth that ends up being made.
So in the spirit of anti-transparency that is and has become a sort of common theme on this podcast, I want to just kind of briefly mention here, the White House has announced they are delaying the release of the JFK assassination files to, quote, protect against identifiable harm, which is a fascinating quote to me. So President Biden said the delay was, quote, necessary to protect against identifiable harm to the military defense, intelligence operations, law enforcement, or the conduct of foreign relations,
right,
and that this outweighs the public interest in immediate disclosure. U.S. law requires that all government records on the assassination be disclosed to, quote, enable to the public to become fully informed, end quote. So what does he mean by protect against identifiable harm? Because that's a really interesting way of wording your reasoning. Because we're now how far past this fucking thing? JFK's killing. I mean, we're 60 plus years.
So
yeah, right around 60 years. Yeah, and so
on UFO Twitter, right? To circle our wagons around here. So on UFO Twitter, I had seen folks inferring and suggesting that this was it's something to do with these documents and JFK's association with like 60s UFO intelligence that was the reason that these files weren't being declassified. But I think that
I don't buy it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a zany take, but I think that it's worth thinking of the UAP thing right now when we think about the limits of disclosure, right? Is because like you say, we are well past the direct political relevance of any facts that could be dredged up by JFK.
The conspiracy that JFK, there's like a serious conspiracy out there. I shouldn't say serious, but I mean, I say serious in terms of popularity. Like that JFK found out some kind of information about UFOs or something and was killed for it.
Yeah.
And this is coming from somebody who is very interested in that topic, and I think that's absolute fucking baloney.
Sure.
By that point in American history, in 1963, the secret had been well privatized, and there was no way a sitting U.S. president was going to get access to something that was, deep in the bowels of, some private defense contractor, in the Nevada desert, basically.
For sure, but I do think that it's like you should be conscious that like this is ultimately the regime of classification that we're up against here, right? And in terms of getting meaningful things out of the state regarding UAP, it's look at these files that still remain classified regarding the JFK assassination.
GOP Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, who is a physician, called for senility tests for aging political leaders. So,
and I mean, he's a medical professional, right?
He is.
Bill Cassidy is.
Yes. Yeah. So he's a physician. I don't know. I think he's a gastroenterologist or was one. Yes, gastroenterologist.
He gave this quote. He says, quote, "It's usually noticeable. So anybody in a position of responsibility who may potentially be on that slope, that's of concern. And I'm saying this as a doctor." and I was thinking about making this point at the top of when you'd mentioned this story earlier, is just to think about what it's really like when you have somebody in a position of power who is beyond their faculties. Is that like, I mean, and this is what Ruth Bader Ginsburg had was a team of clerks that were pointing her in the right direction. There was, I believe it was Katie Couric has a book out where she's talking about the ways in which she and editors at NBC covered her senility regarding certain responses that she gave about Colin Kaepernick and that controversy with the NFL and all this stuff. We have folks who are in meaningful positions of power who are absolutely past being competent stewards of that power. The Washington is run by lanyards. Washington's run by 20-something kids in lanyards, while perfectly mentally competent senators and House representatives just fuck off to the Capitol Grill or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's already just the way Washington runs. Is there's the people who are the symbols of the power, and then there's the people who actually do the work and make the thing run. And so when you start talking about like, Nancy Pelosi or what's her face from California,
Dianne Feinstein. Yeah.
Dianne Feinstein, right? It's like, it's like these people are not there. They have staffs that are running this office that are effectively pulling voting levers.
Quarter of their age.
right. And that this is going on from Supreme Court justices to congressional, officials or whatever. And I think that it's like, you can say on the one hand, there should be a policy like this. You can say on the other hand that,
I'm 100% for it. No, I will 100% agree with him on this. Like this needs to happen.
Right. But I think that, and I mean, I think if these are meaningful vectors of like power in our society, absolutely. But I think really what it reveals,
people who are 80 years old at this point in human history should have no fucking vote on what's going to be impacting future generations when they're.
But look at Joe Biden. Look at Joe Biden. Joe Biden was pretending to hold a podium on national television this week because he didn't know how to talk to the public without having his hands in that position, right? Like if there was really a meaningful difference in our policy outcomes that could be had by like symbolically supplanting the gerontocracy for like younger, more competent people, like I think we would see other ramifications from having these folks in positions of power right now. But I think the concerning thing that might be revealed by the fact that people can persist in these roles long past their.
So many of these people would be out of a job if this was a law.
There isn't anything about these folks having functioning mental faculties that like redounds to these systems working more effectively or pursuing policy outcomes that are favorable. Like it's just like these are just vessels of
they're vessels,
party and elite.
We have gone now from one president, the most previous president who was sundowning, to another president who is sundowning. So like I'm just saying that.
Right. No, but I think it's a symptom, right?
Yeah.
Like I think it's I think it's a symptom of political systems and institutions that are relatively meaningless, right, in their capacity to actually affect change. And so it doesn't matter, right, if Feinstein or Pelosi or Biden or Trump are completely out to lunch, right? Because there's nothing that these folks would do anyway other than rubber stamp whatever the will of the elites in the party were to begin with. This is an independently produced podcast. You can follow us on Twitter @COINTELPROPod and support more of our work on our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes and in our Twitter bio. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.